In Regency England, madness was a sentence. Not the madness of asylums, though that fate awaited those without title or fortune, but the quieter, more suffocating madness of reputation. A whisper at a ball. A knowing glance across a drawing room. A name spoken in lowered voices with that particular combination of pity and relish that polite society reserved for its most satisfying scandals. The Duke of Brackington is crazy. Everyone said so. No one could prove it. But proof, in the world of the ton, was never truly the point. The point was the whisper. The point was the isolation. The point was the way invitations stopped arriving and morning calls ceased, and an entire man, his intelligence, his honor, his carefully ordered inner world, collapsed into a single, merciless word and left there to rot. And into this whisper steps 18-year-old Arabella Voss, too educated, too opinionated, too entirely herself for a society that required its women decorative and its truths comfortable. Her family has run out of patience and out of options. The Duke of Brackington has, inexplicably, made an offer. No one else has. The answer, therefore, is obvious. She will marry the crazy Duke. She has heard the stories, the violent episodes, the erratic behavior, the sealed manner that admits no visitors and releases no information. She has constructed, from these fragments, a portrait of the life awaiting her and found it sufficiently grim to constitute a kind of armor. If one expects nothing, one cannot be disappointed. She expects nothing. But she is wrong about almost everything. Because on the night of their wedding, in a room lit by a single lamp, the Duke of Brackington sits across from his new wife at a careful and deliberate distance, and begins to speak the truth. Not the truth society has constructed about him. Not the truth his enemies have cultivated, but the real truth offered plainly, without decoration, to the only person he has decided deserves to hear it. And Arabella Voss, who believed she had already survived the worst that her world could arrange for her, discovers that the most dangerous thing she will ever encounter is not a madman. It is an honest one. Hey guys, I need your help in getting this channel to 500 subscribers. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. Now let's continue the story. Chapter 1. The Marriage and the Revelation. The church was cold. It was the first thing Arabella Voss noticed on the morning of her wedding, not the sparse gathering of witnesses arranged in the pews like an afterthought, not the gray November light pressing through the narrow windows, not even the curious and barely concealed expressions of those few souls who had come to observe what polite society had privately declared the most bewildering match of the season. It was the cold. Bone-deep, unapologetic, settling into the stones of St. Margaret's Parish Church as though it had always lived there and intended to remain long after every human drama conducted within its walls had been entirely forgotten. Arabella found this appropriate. She had not expected warmth. She stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that had been her mother's, altered hastily and imperfectly, the seams slightly strained at the shoulders in a manner that would have mortified a woman with more to lose, and she kept her spine straight and her hands still and her expression composed with the particular discipline of a person who has long since learned that feeling things visibly is a luxury one cannot always afford. She was 18 years old. She was, by the assessment of nearly everyone who knew her, entirely unmarriageable. And she was about to wed the Duke of Brackington. The crazy Duke. She had heard the name applied in that manner so consistently, and with such confident relish, that it had long ceased to function as insult and achieved instead the peculiar status of established fact. The sort of thing one did not question because questioning it would suggest one had not been paying attention. The Duke of Brackington was mad. Everyone said so. No one had witnessed it directly, or if they had, the accounts varied so wildly in their particulars that they cancelled each other out entirely, leaving only the essential conclusion intact. He was not safe, he was not sane, and no family of sound reputation and reasonable expectations would deliver a daughter to his door. Arabella's family had delivered her to his door. This said a great deal, she reflected, about what her family thought of her. She had catalogued their grievances often enough to recite them without effort. She read too much, not the approved materials, not the gentle accomplishments of watercolor instruction and improving verse, but philosophy and political theory and natural sciences that she borrowed from her father's library in the years before her father had thought to restrict her access. She argued, not the decorative disagreement permitted to clever women in certain drawing rooms, performed for the entertainment of men who wish to appear broad-minded, but actual argument, conducted with evidence and pursued to conclusion regardless of whether the conclusion was comfortable. She had, at 17, corrected the theological reasoning of a visiting clergyman at dinner and watched the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees in as many seconds. She had not apologized. Her mother had wept. Her brother had declared her willfully perverse. Her aunt had suggested, not for the first time, that certain young women of excessive intelligence were constitutionally incapable of happiness and ought to be encouraged toward resignation as early as possible. Arabella had listened to all of this with the expression she had been perfecting since childhood, attentive, composed, entirely unrepentant, and had understood, with the clarity that characterized her thinking on most subjects, that her family was not wrong about her prospects. She was, by every measure the marriage market recognized, damaged goods. The Duke of Brackenton's offer had therefore arrived less as a surprise than as an inevitability. She had spent the preceding fortnight constructing, from fragments of rumor and second-hand account, a portrait of the life awaiting her. It was not a flattering portrait. Brackenton Manor was said to be sealed against visitors. The Duke was said to alternate between preternatural stillness and episodes of violence that his household managed with the practiced silence of long-suffering experience. He had no friends that anyone could identify, no social engagements for 3 years past, and a reputation so thoroughly ruined that his title and fortune, both considerable, had not been sufficient to attract a single family willing to negotiate seriously. Until hers. Arabella had resolved, with considerable deliberateness, to expect nothing. She had arranged her expectations in the lowest possible configuration and fixed them there. If one anticipated nothing, disappointment became structurally impossible. She had found this a useful philosophy before and saw no reason to abandon it now. She heard the church door open behind her. The gathering, such as it was, shifted with a collective, barely perceptible intake of breath, and Arabella understood from this alone, before she turned, before she saw anything, that the Duke of Brackenton had arrived and that he had produced, simply by entering a room, exactly the effect his reputation prepared one for. She turned. He was tall. This was the first and most immediate fact, tall and dark and dressed with an exactness that suggested either considerable care or a very capable valet, his coat a deep charcoal, his cravat tied with precise correctness, every detail of his appearance arranged with a kind of meticulous order that spoke not of vanity but of control. He was, she estimated, perhaps 30, though something in the quality of his stillness made precise age difficult to determine. He walked with even, unhurried steps up the aisle of St. Margaret's, and she watched him come and found herself revising, rapidly and uncomfortably, every assumption she had made. He did not look mad. He looked, if anything, extraordinarily composed. Dark eyes swept the interior of the church with a calm, assessing intelligence that catalogued and dismissed and settled, finally, on Arabella herself with an attention so steady and so entirely unperformed that she felt, absurdly, as though she were the one being evaluated. He reached the altar. He inclined his head to her with precise correctness, not warmth, not coldness, but the careful neutrality of a man who has decided in advance what each gesture will and will not communicate. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low and even, controlled, as everything about him was controlled. She had expected something, she was not certain what, precisely. Erratic energy, perhaps. The visible signs of an unstable mind. Instead she received the disquieting impression of a man who had gathered every aspect of his external presentation into meticulous order and maintained it there through sheer and continuous effort. This, she realized, unsettled her more than wildness would have. Wildness she could have met with a kind of braced endurance, the armor of lowered expectations brought usefully to bear. But this composure, this dark, watchful steadiness, she had not prepared for, and the absence of preparation left her at a disadvantage she did not appreciate. "Your Grace," she replied, and was gratified to find her own voice equally level. The ceremony was brief. The clergyman conducted it with the slightly rushed air of a man who had been given to understand that efficiency was preferred, and the Duke spoke his responses with quiet clarity, every word correct, every pause measured, nothing performed and nothing withheld. Arabella spoke hers with equal steadiness and fixed her gaze on the middle distance and told herself, firmly, that composure was entirely possible and that she was, above all things, a practical woman. She was less convincing on the latter point than she would have wished. When it was concluded, the Duke offered his arm with the same precise correctness he had maintained throughout, and she took it, and they walked from the church into the gray November morning as the sparse gathering of witnesses watched them go with expressions that ranged from barely concealed pity to unconcealed fascination. Arabella did not look back. The journey to Brackenton Manor consumed the better part of 3 hours, conducted in a well-appointed carriage across increasingly rural roads as the afternoon light failed and the countryside grew wilder and less managed. The Duke sat opposite her and looked out of the window in silence, and Arabella sat and looked at him and tried to reconcile the evidence before her with the portrait she had constructed. He had not spoken since the church. He did not appear agitated by the silence. He appeared, if anything, to find it preferable. She did not attempt conversation. She was not yet certain what conversation was available to them, and she had a strong instinct against speaking simply to fill emptiness. Brackenton Manor emerged from the failing light as a large, severe structure of dark stone, its windows lit from within, its grounds extending into shadow on either side. It was not welcoming. It was, however, undeniably substantial, and as they passed through the gates and drew up before the entrance, Arabella adjusted her assessment of her situation with the pragmatic thoroughness that had always been her most reliable quality. Whatever awaited her within, she would meet it as she had met everything else, with clear eyes and an entirely undecorated understanding of what was actually before her. She was shown to a chamber of considerable size and unexpected order, and a maid attended her with quiet competence, and she sat before the fire in the gray silk she had changed into and waited with her hands folded and her mind working and her carefully arranged expectations held precisely in place. An hour passed. Then a knock at the door. "Your Grace," said the maid, addressing the corridor, "Her Grace is in the sitting room as requested." The Duke entered and dismissed the maid with a brief word and closed the door with care. He was still composed. He was always, it seemed, composed. He crossed to the chair opposite hers, not the chair beside her, not a position suggesting proximity, and sat with the deliberate, careful movement she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, and regarded her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then he said, "I owe you an honest account of yourself and your situation, miss." He paused, with what she thought was the faintest self-correction. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I shall require some small period of adjustment to the title." "As shall I," Arabella said. Something crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible. She thought it might have been acknowledgement. "I will be direct," he said. "I am told it is not always a comfortable quality. I have found, however, that it is the only one I can consistently maintain." "I have been told the same," Arabella said, "about myself, in rather less neutral terms." He studied her. "Then we may understand one another. What I am about to tell you is the truth of my situation. All of it, without the modifications society employs to make difficult things easier to hear. You deserve the actual truth, and I find I have no interest in offering anything else." Arabella said nothing. She waited. "I am not mad," the Duke said. The fire crackled between them. Outside the windows, the wind had risen. "I suffer from a neurological condition," he continued, in the same even, careful tone. "Its episodes produce tremor, temporary paralysis of the limbs, and periods of sensory overwhelm in which sound and light become genuinely unbearable. They are unpredictable in their timing. They are not dangerous, except insofar as a loss of physical control is inherently undignified and occasionally results in injury through falling. They are, however, entirely beyond what the medical establishment currently possesses the vocabulary to categorize, and what the medical establishment cannot categorize, society invariably labels lunacy." Arabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you allowed them to?" "Yes. Deliberately." Yes. His eyes did not waver. Isolation is considerably simpler to maintain when people believe one dangerous rather than merely inconvenient. A dangerous man is avoided. An inconvenient one is managed, advised, supervised, and subjected to the persistent well-meaning interference of persons who are confident they know better. I have found the former preferable. Arabella considered this. It was, she acknowledged privately, a not entirely unreasonable calculation. And the violent episodes the rumors describe? Exaggeration built upon exaggeration, constructed from a single incident 7 years ago in which I experienced an episode in a public setting and several witnesses provided accounts shaped more by their own alarm than by observable fact. The pause. I did not help matters by refusing to offer any correction. Silence, in such circumstances, functions as confirmation. Why tell me now? He was still for a moment. The fire moved behind him. Because you are my wife, he said, and because you have been delivered to this house on the basis of information that is almost entirely false, and because whatever this arrangement is, whatever it may become, I will not have it built on a foundation of convenient fiction. Arabella looked at him steadily. Why did you accept the offer? Specifically. There is, I understand, a shortage of families willing to negotiate with you. You might have had your choice among those who were. Something in his expression shifted, not warmth, precisely, but a quality adjacent to it. Your family's account of you was thorough, he said. Remarkably so. Too educated. Too opinionated. Too entirely unwilling to perform the decorative helplessness her situation required. The faintest pause. I required a wife of genuine intelligence. One who would not flinch from truth, who could not be managed by appeals to convention, who possessed sufficient quality of mind to hear an honest account of a difficult situation and respond to it rationally rather than theatrically. Your family's assessment of you as damaged was, in my estimation, the highest possible recommendation. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people recalibrating. Arabella looked at the man across from her, this composed, controlled, solitary man who had chosen her specifically because every quality that made her unwanted elsewhere had, in his particular calculus, made her exactly what he needed, and she understood that she had arrived at Brackenton Manor prepared for one kind of life and found, in its place, something she did not yet have adequate language to describe. She did not know whether to be relieved. The revelation removed the threat she had steeled herself against and replaced it with a reality far more nuanced and far less straightforward. She did not know whether to be insulted. She had been selected with the careful logic one applied to a practical problem. His appreciation of her qualities, genuine as it seemed, had originated in utility. She was not certain how she felt about being useful. She did not know whether to be fascinated, and yet she was. Undeniably, uncomfortably she was. She settled, after a moment's rigorous internal accounting, on all three. I see, she said at last. I expect, the Duke replied with that same precise evenness, that you have questions. Several hundred, Arabella said. I shall endeavor to begin with the most pressing. And for the first time since she had met him, at the altar, in the carriage, across this careful room, she thought she saw, at the very edges of his controlled and guarded expression, the shadow of something that might, in different circumstances and with considerably more time, become a smile. Chapter 2. Walls and Windows. 3 months into her marriage, Arabella Voss, the Duchess of Brackenton, a title she was still occasionally surprised to find attached to her person, had developed the habit of rising before the household and walking the east wing of the manor in the grey early hours before breakfast, when the corridors were empty and the light came through the tall windows in long, pale sheets and the whole vast house belonged, temporarily, to no one in particular. It was, she had discovered, the finest hour Brackenton Manor offered. The house itself was not what she had expected, which was, she reflected, becoming something of a pattern in her current life. She had anticipated neglect, the visible entropy of a household long since abandoned to isolation and indifference. What she found instead was order of a very specific and deliberate kind. The rooms were clean and well maintained, the staff small but quietly competent, the whole establishment operating on rhythms so carefully established that the house ran with the precision of a well-regulated clock. She had understood, within a fortnight, that the rhythms were designed. Every aspect of daily life at Brackenton had been arranged to minimize unpredictability, sound, disruption, the sudden and jarring intrusions that could, she now understood, precipitate the Duke's episodes. She had adapted to these rhythms without difficulty. She had always been, beneath the sharp edges that made her inconvenient in drawing rooms, a fundamentally orderly person. The difficulty was not the order. The difficulty was the space between the order, the long, quiet afternoons in her sitting room with her books and her thoughts, and the particular quality of silence that was not peaceful but simply empty. She had her own chambers, her own schedule, more genuine freedom than she had possessed in her entire previous life. Her mother's household had operated on the principle that a young woman's movements, occupations, and opinions required constant supervision and periodic correction. Here, no one supervised her. No one corrected her. No one, for considerable stretches of time, spoke to her at all. She was, technically, content. She was also, if she applied to herself the rigorous honesty she applied to everything else, genuinely lonely. She had not expected to notice the Duke's absence when he was not present. She had not expected to find his presence, on the occasions when it occurred, the most interesting thing available to her. She had expected indifference in both directions, the civil distance of two people sharing a house by legal obligation, and indifference had not materialized. In its place had grown something considerably more complicated and considerably more difficult to categorize. It had begun with the books. 3 weeks into their marriage, she had returned to her sitting room after breakfast to find a volume placed on her writing table, a work of natural philosophy she had not previously encountered, its cover worn with genuine use, a small folded note tucked inside the front page. The handwriting was precise and economical. It read, "I observed your interest in the natural history texts in the library. This may be of further use to you." She had read the book in 2 days. She had left it on the breakfast table with a note of her own. The argument in the 3rd chapter requires more rigorous evidential support than the author provides. The conclusion is correct but arrives there by insufficient means. The book had disappeared. 2 days later, a second volume appeared in its place. This one accompanied by a note that read, "You may find the author's earlier work addresses the evidential gap. The conclusion, as you observe, is sound. The methodology is the difficulty with a great deal of natural philosophy." This had been, Arabella recognized in retrospect, the beginning. The notes accumulated. They began in the register of useful information, recommended texts, observations on shared reading, the occasional dry correction of a point she had made too broadly, and shifted, by imperceptible degrees, into something warmer and more personal. He had a dry wit that did not translate to formal spoken conversation but emerged on the page with considerable precision. She had begun to look forward to the notes with an eagerness she considered somewhat undignified and was entirely unable to suppress. Their in-person interactions remained, by contrast, carefully correct. They met at dinner with the regularity of an established routine, and conversation was conducted with propriety and increasing genuineness. He asked about her reading and listened to her answers with genuine attention. She asked about the estate management and received replies of real substance, offered without the condescension she had learned to expect from men discussing practical matters with women. He did not simplify. He did not redirect her toward more suitable topics. He answered what she asked, and occasionally, toward the end of the meal, the conversation acquired a momentum that carried it past the merely correct into something approaching real exchange. But he was always careful, always measured. The wall was always present, not hostile, not cold, but deliberate. A maintained distance that she had begun to suspect cost him something, though she could not yet determine what. She was considering precisely this question on a Thursday afternoon in February when she went to the library in search of a volume on Roman legal theory she had been unable to locate in her sitting room, and found the Duke already there. He was standing at the far window with a book open in his hands, his back partially toward her, and he had not heard her enter. She paused in the doorway, struck by the unfamiliar image of him in an unguarded moment. the strict composure slightly loosened, his posture less precisely maintained, something in the set of his shoulders that suggested he was, in this unobserved instant, simply a man standing in a room he liked, reading a book he was interested in, without the continuous management of external presentation that accompanied his presence in company. She must have made some small sound because he turned. "Your Grace," he said, and the composure resettled itself immediately, like a curtain drawn back across a window. "Forgive me, I had not expected you. Nor I you. I shall not disturb you. I am only in search of the Justinian commentary. I believe it is in the 3rd section. "The 2nd, he said. "3rd shelf from the top. I can—" He stopped. She saw it happen. There was no drama to it, no warning and no gradual onset. One moment he was crossing toward the shelves with even, directed steps, and the next his right hand, raised to indicate the relevant shelf, had begun to tremble with a fine, rapid movement entirely outside his control, and the tremor moved up his arm and he stopped walking and his left hand came up and gripped the edge of the nearest shelf with white-knuckled steadiness, as though anchoring himself to it, and his eyes closed. Arabella did not move for a half-second, not from alarm, but from the instinctive understanding that movement itself might constitute an intrusion. Then she walked toward him with deliberate, quiet steps and stopped at a distance she judged as near enough to be useful without being overwhelming. "What do you require?" she said. Her voice was level and practical. She did not ask if he was all right, because she could observe that he was not all right and the question would have been decorative rather than useful. His jaw was set. The tremor had spread to his shoulder. His eyes remained closed. "Silence," he said, through teeth that were not quite clenched. "The light. The window." She crossed to the window without a word and drew the heavy curtain across it, reducing the gray February light to a dim and manageable warmth. Then she returned to where she had been standing and was silent, and stayed silent, and did not move, and did not speak, and did not perform any of the various gestures of distress that would have required him to manage her reaction on top of managing his own person. The minutes passed. 5, perhaps, or 6. The tremor gradually subsided. His grip on the shelf loosened by degrees. His breathing, which had been carefully controlled throughout, steadied further. When he opened his eyes, she was still standing where she had been standing, her hands folded, her expression attentive and entirely composed. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not immediately interpret. It was not gratitude, exactly, or not only that. It was something more complex, something that suggested he had expected a different response and was still, quietly, recalibrating. "Thank you," he said at last. "Do you require anything further? To your—" "No." Pause. "I shall be quite well in a few minutes. These episodes resolve of their own course." Another pause, shorter. "You did not panic." "I saw no utility in it," Arabella said. Something moved across his face again. That quality she was beginning to identify as the closest he came, in unguarded moments, to genuine warmth. "No," he said quietly. "I imagine you did not." He recovered fully within the quarter hour, as he had said he would, and she found the Justinian commentary, 2nd section, 3rd shelf from the top, precisely as he had indicated, and they sat for the remainder of the afternoon in the library in adjacent chairs and read in companionable silence, and neither of them remarked upon what had occurred, and both of them were, she thought, the better for the unremarkedness of it. That evening at dinner, something had shifted. The conversation was still correct. They were always correct. But the careful distance felt slightly less like a wall and slightly more like a habit that was becoming, by degrees, unnecessary. He spoke more freely. She asked the questions she had been accumulating for weeks rather than selecting only the most safely impersonal. He told her about the estate, not the simplified account one offered to satisfy polite inquiry, but the actual complexity of it, the tenant disputes and drainage problems, and the neighboring landowner whose boundary claims were both legally dubious and deeply tiresome. She told him that the legal argument against the boundary claim was straightforward and outlined it precisely, and he listened with the expression of a man being told something useful by a source he had not previously considered, and asked a follow-up question, and received a follow-up answer, and by the end of the meal they had been talking for 2 hours without either of them noting the passage of time. After that, the wall remained, but the windows in it multiplied. He began to stay longer after dinner. Their written exchanges grew from brief observations into extended dialogues that occasionally continued across 3 or 4 days on a single question: the nature of political obligation, the epistemological foundations of natural science, the proper limits of individual liberty in an ordered society. He argued with precision and genuine conviction. She argued back with equal precision and no conviction whatever that the force of his title or his intelligence excused him from the requirement of logical consistency. He found this, she gathered from the slight but perceptible increase in engagement his notes took on during disagreement, rather more invigorating than he had perhaps anticipated. She found it, if she was honest, the most genuine intellectual companionship she had encountered in her life. She began to see him more clearly. The dry which she had detected on the page was present in spoken conversation too, she discovered, once he relaxed sufficient to allow it, a precise, understated humor that appeared without announcement and disappeared before it could be mistaken for performance. He had opinions on everything and offered them with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a great deal of time thinking and a rather smaller amount of time having those thoughts engaged with seriously. When she engaged with them seriously, agreed, disagreed, extended, challenged, he responded with an attention that was, she recognized, simply the attention of a very intelligent person who had been lonely for a very long time. This was the thing she had not expected. Not the intelligence, she had inferred intelligence from his notes, but the loneliness. It was not declared. He would not have declared it. But it was present in the quality of his attention when she spoke, in the way the conversations after dinner had begun to extend and extend as though neither of them was quite willing to be the one who ended them, in the notes that had started arriving twice a day instead of once. He was, beneath the controlled exterior, profoundly alone. He had been alone for years. He had arranged his life for aloneness and defended it with considerable ingenuity and had believed, she suspected, that he had made his peace with it. She understood this. She had made her own arrangements with loneliness. She had told herself, for years, that she preferred solitude to the performance required for company, and this had been true enough for long enough that she had stopped examining it. She was examining it now. In the evenings, after dinner, when she returned to her sitting room and sat by the fire and thought over the conversation just concluded, she found herself engaged in a new and slightly alarming habit of thought. She would replay a particular exchange, or a moment in which he had said something that surprised her, or the expression on his face during the library episode when he had looked at her with that unreadable quality that she was beginning, slowly, to read. She would examine these moments with the same rigorous attention she applied to textual arguments and find them, invariably, more interesting on second examination than on first. She was aware that this was not a safe direction of thought. She was also aware that she had entirely lost the capacity to think of Brackenton Manor as a sentence. It had happened without announcement and without her permission. She could not have identified the precise moment. But somewhere between the first book left on her writing table and the long February afternoon in the library and the dinners that extended into the late evening with neither of them willing to observe the hour, somewhere in the accumulated texture of 3 months of careful, genuine, increasingly essential daily life, the manor had become simply where she lived, where she was, in the ways that mattered, herself. The Duke, for his part, sat in his study on the same February evening and regarded the note he had just written, the latest in a correspondence that had begun as practical utility and become something he no longer had adequate language to describe with accuracy, and acknowledged, with the intellectual honesty that was among his most inconvenient qualities, that he had made an error in his calculations. He had selected a wife with precision and purpose. He had required intelligence, practicality, the capacity to receive truth without catastrophizing it. He had acquired all three. The arrangement had proceeded exactly as designed. He had not designed for this. He had not accounted, in his meticulous calculations, for the possibility that a woman of genuine intelligence and formidable character, encountered daily under conditions of unusual honesty, might become, steadily, undeniably, with no dramatic moment he could identify as origin, entirely necessary. He had not designed for the particular quality of stillness she had maintained in the library. For the way she argued, clean and direct and entirely without performance. For the expression on her face during the conversations that extended past midnight, when she was engaged and unself-conscious and more entirely herself than most people managed in a lifetime. He had not, in short, designed for any of this. He set down his pen. He recognized, with the alarm of a man confronting evidence he cannot dismiss, in very serious difficulty. Chapter 3. Confession and Complication. 6 months into her marriage, Arabella had developed a precise and private vocabulary for the thing that existed between herself and the Duke of Brackenton, a vocabulary composed entirely of negatives, because the positive terms available to her were either inadequate or alarming. It was not indifference that had been established within the first fortnight. It was not mere intellectual companionship, though it contained that quality in abundance. Intellectual companionship did not account for the way her attention moved to him the moment he entered a room, or the way a day in which they did not speak felt structurally incomplete in a manner she could not attribute to habit alone. It was not gratitude, though she was grateful, for the books, for the honest account he had offered her on their wedding night, for the consistent and undecorated respect with which he treated her mind. Gratitude was a clean, manageable feeling. What she carried was neither clean nor manageable. She had been avoiding the accurate word for approximately 6 weeks. On a Tuesday morning in April, with the grounds of Brackenton Manor emerging from winter into a pale and tentative spring and the breakfast table between them occupied by a comfortable silence that had long since ceased to require filling, Arabella looked across at her husband, who was reading the morning correspondence with the focused attention he brought to everything, his dark head slightly bent, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness that characterized all his physical movements, and she acknowledged, with the full rigor she applied to every other question she had ever examined, that she was in love with him. Not from obligation. Not from the softening of proximity, the way long acquaintance could produce an affection one mistook for something more significant. Not from gratitude for his reasonable treatment of her, which was a real thing but a separate thing, and she was not a woman who confused the two. She loved him specifically and inconveniently, the dry wit and the formidable intelligence and the deep, carefully defended loneliness of him, the way he argued and the way he listened and the way he had looked at her in the library in February with that expression she had spent 4 months learning to read and now read with a clarity that was, in its own way, its own difficulty. She looked at him across the breakfast table and she knew it completely, and she said nothing whatsoever, because she was a practical woman and the knowing of a thing and the saying of it were entirely separate decisions. He looked up from his correspondence and met her gaze and said, "The drainage reports from the North Field are more optimistic than last quarter," and she said, "That is encouraging," and they continued their breakfast in their customary comfortable silence, and nothing changed, and everything had changed, and she was not yet certain what to do about the difference. The written exchanges had, by this point, become something she suspected neither of them could have done without. They had moved far beyond the territory of books and ideas, though they covered those still, with undiminished enthusiasm, into the more personal and more unguarded register of genuine confidence. He had told her, in a note written in his precise hand one late March evening, that the estate had been his primary purpose for years and that he had recently found himself questioning whether purpose constructed in isolation retained its meaning indefinitely. She had told him, in reply, that she had spent her entire previous life being told who she was by people with no genuine interest in the question, and that she had not known until Brackenton what it felt like to be known accurately. He had not replied to that note immediately. When he did, the response was brief: "I find I am glad you are here." It was the most direct personal statement he had yet committed to paper, and she had read it 6 times and then set it in the drawer of her writing table where she kept the notes she did not throw away, which was all of them. In person, the restraint cost them both visibly, though neither acknowledged this. The dinners that extended into late evening, the conversations that had to be ended by one of them exercising conscious decision because neither would end them naturally, these had acquired a quality of tension beneath the warmth that was not uncomfortable, precisely, but was impossible to ignore. She was aware of him in a way she had not been before the April morning at the breakfast table, or perhaps had been before and could now no longer attribute to anything other than what it was. He was, she thought, equally aware. But the wall remained. The windows had multiplied and the light came through them freely, but the wall remained, and she had begun to understand that it was maintained not by coldness but by something more complicated, something she did not yet have sufficient information to fully comprehend. The physician arrived on a Wednesday. She did not know, initially, that he was a physician. He was announced as a Dr. Harwell, come from London on a professional visit, and the Duke received this information at luncheon with an expression that did not change and a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, tighter, more deliberate, the composure of a man suppressing a response rather than simply existing in one. Arabella noted this and filed it and said nothing. Dr. Harwell was installed in one of the guest rooms and met with the Duke privately that afternoon, and Arabella spent the afternoon in the library with a book she read approximately none of, her attention occupied instead by the low murmur of voices from the study down the corridor and the quality of the Duke's expression at luncheon and the question of what, precisely, a specialist physician arrived unannounced from London to conduct a private consultation represented. She arrived at the answer by early evening, when she went to return a book to the study and found, on the desk in the disorder left by a hastily concluded meeting, a letter bearing a solicitor's seal that had been inadequately tucked beneath a ledger. She did not read it fully. She read enough: the Duke's name, the phrase mental competency assessment, the names of two distant relatives she had heard mentioned once in passing as the Duke's nearest surviving family, and the date, which was 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks prior. She set the book down on the desk. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went to find her husband. He was in the East Garden, which was where he walked in the evenings when the light was failing and the grounds were quiet. She found him on the far path and fell into step beside him, and they walked in silence for a moment, and she allowed the silence because she was arranging her words with care, and because she was considerably more angry than she wished to appear before she had said what she intended to say. "Dr. Harwell," she said at last, "is not here for a professional consultation." The Duke did not stop walking. "No," he said. "He was sent by your relatives. Cousins, I believe, on your father's side. They have engaged a solicitor and are pursuing a formal assessment of your mental competency. If the assessment supports their case, they may petition for legal incapacitation, which would transfer control of your estates, your title, and effectively your person to their management." She paused. "I found the letter." "I see." His voice was even. It was always even. "You knew." "Yes. You have known for 6 weeks at minimum. Possibly longer." "Since January," he said. "I became aware of their intentions in January." Arabella stopped walking. He stopped also and turned to face her, and his expression was composed and careful, and she looked at it and felt the anger settle into something colder and more precise. "You have known since January," she said, "that there existed a direct and serious legal threat to your liberty and your estate, and you did not tell me." "I did not wish to." "If the next word," Arabella said, with a quietness that was considerably more forceful than volume would have been, "is burden, I would ask you to reconsider it very carefully before it leaves your mouth." He was silent. "I am your wife," she said. "I am not a guest in this house whom you are obligated to keep comfortable. I am not a problem you have solved and set aside. I am your wife, and this threat concerns me directly, my situation, my security, my future, and you maintained it in careful concealment for 4 months while corresponding with me daily about political philosophy and estate drainage and everything except the single most significant material fact of our shared circumstances." Her voice remained entirely level. This was, she knew, more frightening than anger would have been. "Why?" He held her gaze. The composure was still present, but something beneath it was under considerable strain. "I did not wish you to be troubled by difficulties that are mine to manage." "Your difficulties," Arabella said, "became mine the morning of our wedding. That is the nature of the institution we entered. I did not agree to a partial account of our situation. I agreed, on the basis of the honest account you offered me on our wedding night, to the full one." She paused. "You told me, on that night, that you had no interest in anything built on convenient fiction, that you would offer me truth without modification. I have conducted myself on that basis for 6 months. And in 6 months, you have been managing me. The word landed with precision because it was the accurate word, and they both knew it. Something in his expression broke. It was not dramatic. It was the subtle, structural fracture of a control that had been maintained for a very long time under increasing and finally unsustainable pressure. He looked at her, and for a moment he was simply a man without the careful architecture of composure between himself and whatever it was he had been holding at careful distance for months. "I did not tell you," he said, "because I did not wish you to feel obligated." Obligated. To act. To involve yourself. To expend your considerable abilities on a difficulty that is mine by origin and that I have no right to place at your feet. He was quiet for a moment. "You came to this house without choice. You have made the best of circumstances you did not select. What you have built here, the life you have constructed within these walls, is yours, and I will not have it complicated by the consequences of my situation any further than it already has been." Arabella looked at him. The anger had not dissolved. She would return to it, she knew, and have more to say, but it had made space for something else, for the understanding of what his answer actually meant and what it revealed about the wall she had been looking at for 6 months without fully comprehending its foundations. "You are protecting me," she said. "I am attempting to. From your own life." He said nothing. Wilfred. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. It arrived because no other word was sufficient for the directness of what she intended to say, and she watched him absorb the sound of it with an expression she recognized now without difficulty. It was the expression of a man being reached, specifically and precisely, in a place he had not expected to be reached. "Why?" The silence stretched between them in the failing April light. The garden was still around them. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was constructing its evening complaint with considerable persistence. "Because I love you," he said. The words were quiet and entirely without decoration, offered in the same direct register he brought to every truth he had ever told her, and they landed with exactly the weight of something that had been true for a very long time and was being said for the first time. "I have loved you for months. Since February, I believe, though I suspect the honest answer is earlier, and February is simply the point at which I could no longer maintain a contrary argument with any intellectual credibility." The pause. "And because I cannot offer you a life without difficulty. The condition does not resolve. The social consequences of this marriage do not diminish. And I do not consider it fair, I have never considered it fair, to ask you to choose a life bound to mine with full knowledge of what that costs you, when you had no choice in the original binding." Arabella was quiet for a moment. The bird continued its complaint. The light was almost gone. "You have constructed," she said at last, "an extremely thorough argument for why you should be permitted to make decisions on my behalf, on the grounds that you love me and therefore know better than I do what I ought to want." He opened his mouth. "I am not finished," she said. "You told me, 6 months ago, that you required a wife who would not flinch from truth and could not be managed by appeals to convention. I have not flinched from a single truth this house has offered me. I have not been managed by anyone. I will not begin now simply because the person doing the managing believes his intentions are good." She met his eyes with complete steadiness. "I am capable of choosing my own life, Wilfred. I am capable of choosing it with full knowledge of its difficulties. That is, as I understand it, precisely why you wanted me." Something moved through his expression, the fracture widening, the composure relinquishing its long-held ground. "You deserve better than—" "I deserve," Arabella said firmly, "to be consulted. That is all I am asking. Not a perfect life. Not a life without difficulty. Merely the basic dignity of being treated as an equal who is capable of bearing the truth of her own circumstances." She paused. "Which is, I believe, what you promised me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, very quietly, "Yes, it is." "Then we will address this together," she said. "The physician, the relatives, the solicitor, and whatever legal proceedings they intend to bring. Together. Without management and without concealment." She paused. "Are we agreed?" "We are agreed," he said. The garden was dark now, properly dark, The last of the April lights surrendered to the evening. They stood in it together, and the air between them held everything that had been said and a considerable amount that had not yet been said, and Arabella was aware that she had not told him, had not found the precise moment, in the direct and necessary business of the confrontation, that his declaration had not arrived without answer. There would be time for that. There would be time for a great many things, if they managed what was coming. But what was coming was serious. Dr. Harwell would deliver his assessment. The relatives would receive it. The legal machinery, once set in motion, would require force to stop. The kind of force that did not arrive without preparation and without the deliberate, methodical application of considerable intelligence. She reflected as they walked back toward the lit windows of the manor, quite a great deal of work to do. And in the morning she intended to begin. Chapter 4. Proof and Partnership. They arrived on a Friday. Arabella watched from the upper window of the east wing as the carriages came through the gates, 2 of them, well-appointed and deliberate, moving up the drive with the particular quality of procession that suggested their occupants had rehearsed, at least in their own minds, the significance of their arrival. She counted 4 figures descending. 2 she identified as the Duke's cousins from the descriptions he had provided, 1 she recognized as Dr. Harwell returning with the authority of his completed assessment, and 1 she did not know but whose leather case and careful suit identified him with sufficient clarity as the legal representative. She observed all of this with complete composure and a fury so thoroughly organized that it had long since ceased to resemble fury and had become instead something considerably more useful, the cold, focused energy of a woman who had spent 7 days preparing for precisely this moment and intended to waste none of it on feeling things unproductively. She turned from the window and checked, for the final time, the documents arranged on the writing table before her. The letters from the 3 physicians were there. Dr. Pemberton of Edinburgh, whose published work on neurological conditions was the most progressive available in the current literature. Dr. Ashworth of Bristol, who had corresponded with continental specialists and whose opinion carried the weight of that broader acquaintance. And Dr. Cavendish of London, whose reputation was such that his disagreement with any assessment would require serious professional address. She had written to all 3 within 24 hours of her conversation with the Duke in the garden. She had written with precision and thoroughness, describing the condition in full clinical detail, its symptoms, its patterns, its complete absence of any effect on the Duke's cognitive function or his capacity to manage his affairs. She had asked for written professional opinions. All 3 had replied. All 3 opinions were, in the relevant particulars, unambiguous. Beside the physician's letters sat the estate documentation. She had worked with the Duke's steward for 4 days, extracting 5 years of records, tenancy accounts, drainage investments, crop rotations, legal correspondence regarding the boundary dispute she had herself assisted in resolving, capital expenditure and its returns, the full and meticulous evidence of an estate managed with a competence that would have distinguished any man in England regardless of his health. She had organized this evidence chronologically and by category, with a summary document of her own composition that drew the relevant conclusions in language a legal representative would find difficult to dispute without disputing arithmetic. The counter-argument drafted with Mr. Fielding, the solicitor in the nearest market town, a quiet man of progressive disposition and genuine legal ability who had listened to her outline the situation with careful attention and then said, with the slightly wondering air of a man revising his assumptions in real time, that he believed her argument was sound, sat at the top of the pile, clean and precise and structured with the logical rigor she applied to everything she considered worth the effort. She gathered the documents. She straightened her dress. She went downstairs. The Duke was in the entrance hall receiving his relatives with the composed correctness he brought to all things, and she read the particular quality of his stillness as she descended the stairs and understood that it was costing him more than usual. He looked up at her arrival and something in his expression adjusted, not visibly, not in any way the assembled visitors would have identified, but she read it with the fluency of 6 months of close and genuine attention and understood it as steadiness recognized and returned. "Your Grace," he said, with the slight formality they still employed in company. "Your Grace," she replied, and came to stand beside him with the calm and settled presence of a woman entirely at home in her own house, and turned to regard their visitors with an expression of courteous and complete composure. The elder cousin, Mr. Gerald Forsyth, perhaps 50, with the florid confidence of a man accustomed to his own authority, performed the introductions with the brisk manner of someone conducting business rather than paying a call. The younger cousin, a Mr. Thomas Forsyth of less distinguished appearance and more uncertain bearing, offered a bow that managed to convey both social obligation and personal discomfort in approximately equal measure. Dr. Harwell met Arabella's gaze and looked away first. The legal representative, a Mr. Crane, looked at no one in particular and made notes. "We appreciate your receiving us," Gerald Forsyth said, with the tone of a man who had not genuinely considered the possibility of not being received. "We understand this visit may be somewhat unexpected." "It is not unexpected at all," Arabella said pleasantly. "Shall we go through to the drawing room? I have had refreshments arranged, and I believe we have a considerable amount to discuss." They went through to the drawing room. The Duke sat. The relatives arranged themselves with the slight awkwardness of people who had prepared for one kind of meeting and found themselves in another. Mr. Crane opened his leather case. Dr. Harwell sat beside him with the expression of a man whose professional confidence had been, over the preceding week, subjected to some unforeseen erosion. He had received, she knew, a letter from Dr. Pemberton of Edinburgh, whose opinion of assessments conducted on the basis of social observation rather than clinical evidence had been stated with the diplomatic restraint characteristic of men who are in fact being extremely direct. Gerald Forsyth cleared his throat and began. He spoke for some minutes. The argument was not without structure. The Duke's isolation from society, the reported episodes, the absence of any reliable witness to his capacity, the responsibility of the family to ensure the estate and title were properly maintained for the continuation of the line. He spoke with the authority of a man who had rehearsed and who had not anticipated interruption. Arabella did not interrupt. She sat with her documents in her lap and her hands folded over them and listened to the complete argument with the attentive patience of a woman who wished to ensure she had heard everything before she began. And when Gerald Forsyth concluded with the words, "It is our firm belief that a formal assessment of competency is not only warranted but urgently required," she said, "Thank you. That is a thorough account of your position. May I offer a response?" Forsyth blinked. He had not, she gathered, expected the response to come from her. Naturally, Her Grace is welcome to—" "Excellent," Arabella said, and opened the first document. She began with the physicians. She introduced each letter by its author with a brief account of his professional credentials and reputation. She had done her research on this as thoroughly as on everything else, and the credentials were considerable, and then summarized each opinion in precise and unembellished terms. The condition described was neurological in nature. It did not affect cognitive function. It did not constitute, by any reasonable clinical standard, a basis for a determination of mental incompetence. Dr. Pemberton's language on this point had been particularly clear, and she quoted the relevant passage with careful economy. She then turned to Dr. Harwell. "Dr. Harwell's assessment," she said, with the same composed pleasantness she had maintained throughout, "was conducted on the basis of social observation and second-hand account. He did not conduct a clinical examination. He did not consult the existing literature on neurological conditions, which, while limited, is not absent. He did not correspond with any specialist of relevant expertise before forming his conclusions." She looked at Dr. Harwell with an expression of complete courtesy. "I believe Dr. Pemberton's letter addresses the professional adequacy of that methodology in some detail. I would invite Mr. Crane to read the relevant section." Dr. Harwell's complexion had achieved, over the preceding several minutes, a quality of heightened color that she interpreted as professional discomfort rather than indignation. He did not dispute her characterization. He looked at his hands. Mr. Crane read the relevant section. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she noted the slight pause he took before continuing, which she interpreted as the pause of a man revising his assessment of the proceedings in which he was participating. She moved to the estate documentation. She had organized this portion of her presentation with particular care because it was, in legal terms, the most directly relevant. Mental incompetence, as a basis for incapacitation, required evidence of an inability to manage one's affairs. She therefore presented 5 years of evidence of an estate managed with a thoroughness and intelligence that she enumerated by category: the drainage investments and their returns, the resolution of the tenancy disputes, the legal correspondence, the capital expenditure records, the boundary dispute resolved with a legal argument whose quality Mr. Crane could assess directly from the documentation. She spoke for 40 minutes in total. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation, though she felt it still, cold and organized, beneath every word. She presented her evidence with the composed precision of a woman who had been underestimated comprehensively by nearly every person in her previous life and had learned, with time and considerable practice, that the underestimation of others was among the most reliable advantages available to someone who knew how to use it. The Duke said nothing throughout. He sat to her right and slightly behind her, at the precise angle from which she could not easily see his expression, and she was aware of his attention on her with the specific quality of attention she had learned to distinguish from all others: absolute, unguarded, stripped of the careful management he applied to everything he allowed the world to see. When she finished, the room was quiet. Gerald Forsyth had the appearance of a man whose prepared script had been removed from his hands some time ago and who had been waiting since for the opportunity to resume it, without finding one. Thomas Forsyth was looking at the carpet. Mr. Crane was looking at the estate documentation with the focused attention of a man who had found it, despite his professional neutrality, genuinely arresting. Dr. Harwell had not looked up from his hands for approximately 20 minutes. "I would suggest," Arabella said into the silence, "that Mr. Crane advise his clients on the legal merits of proceeding in light of the evidence presented. I am happy to allow some minutes for that consultation." Mr. Crane looked up. For the first time since the meeting had begun, he looked at her directly, with an expression that was not quite a smile but existed in its vicinity. "I do not believe," he said carefully, "that a private consultation will materially alter the advice I am prepared to offer." He offered it. It was brief, professionally stated, and entirely conclusive. The evidence of competent estate management was extensive and well documented. The medical opinions of 3 specialists of established reputation directly contradicted the assessment on which the petition was founded. The petition, in his professional judgment, would not survive a legal challenge, and he was not able in conscience to recommend its pursuit. Gerald Forsyth argued for a further 10 minutes out of what appeared to be constitutional stubbornness rather than genuine conviction. Thomas Forsyth did not argue at all. Dr. Harwell conceded, in the stiff and careful language of professional retreat, that the progressive opinions presented raised legitimate questions about the clinical basis of his assessment that he would wish to consider further before standing behind its conclusions. By noon, the carriages were being called. The relatives withdrew with the slightly diminished quality of people who had arrived expecting one outcome and were leaving with another, and the sounds of their departure, the cases in the hallway, the brief and reduced farewell, the wheels on the drive, receded into the quiet of the house, and then the house was still, and Arabella stood in the drawing-room with her documents still in her hands and her fury, finally, beginning to release its long-held structure and become something softer, and considerably more tired. She became aware that the Duke had not moved. He was standing near the window, watching her with that expression she had first encountered in the library in February and now read without difficulty, the expression of a man being reached in a place he had not expected, stripped entirely of its usual careful distance. "You prepared all of that," he said, "in 1 week." 7 days, she said. "I found the letter on a Wednesday." He was quiet for a moment. "Arabella." "You are not to thank me," she said immediately. "It was not done for gratitude. It was done because it required doing and because I was the person best placed to do it and because your affairs are my affairs and I intend that to be genuinely true from this point forward rather than theoretically true in legal documentation only." "I was not going to thank you," he said. Something in his voice had shifted, the evenness present but warmer, the control present but no longer defensive. "I was going to tell you that I have never in my life seen anything so precise or so formidable, and that watching you conduct those proceedings was among the most extraordinary experiences of my considerable experience, and that I have run out of arguments for the position I have been maintaining for the past several months. Good, Arabella said. It was not a strong position. No, he agreed. It was not. She set the documents on the side table. The afternoon light was moving across the floor between them, long and golden, the particular quality of April light that did not promise warmth but delivered it anyway. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the space between them had, she thought, finally been reduced to its actual size, which was very small and had perhaps always been. That evening he found her in the garden. The same path where they had stood in the April darkness 2 weeks prior, though the evening now was warmer and the grounds carried the smell of the season turning in earnest. She heard his steps on the path and turned, and he came to stand before her with the quality of a man who has prepared what he intends to say and is saying it without the protection of careful management. I wish to ask you something, he said, that I ought to have asked differently from the beginning. She waited. I wish to begin our marriage honestly, he said. Not as an arrangement entered for practical purpose. Not as a convenience constructed from mutual necessity, but as a genuine partnership between two people who have chosen each other freely, with full knowledge of the difficulties, and without the reservation I have maintained under the misapprehension that it protected you. He paused. I cannot offer you a life without complication. I can offer you complete honesty, genuine equality, and the entirety of whatever I am, without management and without concealment. Another pause, shorter. Will you have me? Freely, and with clear eyes, as your true husband, not by legal documentation but by genuine and mutual choice. Arabella looked at him in the evening light, this precise, controlled, profoundly intelligent and profoundly lonely man who had chosen her because everyone else had found her too much, and who had turned out to be, in all the ways that mattered, exactly enough. Yes, she said, with the characteristic directness that had made her unmarriageable and had, in the end, made her exactly this. I will. Freely, and with entirely clear eyes, and I would ask that you note for future reference that I have been waiting for some months for you to arrive at this question. I am aware, he said, that I have not been efficient. No, she agreed. But you have been honest. I find I prefer that. They were married again privately, in the garden, in their own words, with no witnesses but the evening and the particular quality of the light, and the vows were plain and undecorated and entirely true, and they were, in the ways that actually constituted a marriage, beginning. 1 year later, Brackenton Manor had become a different house. Not in its structure. The dark stone stood as it had always stood, the grounds extended as they had always extended, the quiet rhythms that managed the household remained in place because they were useful and because Arabella had no interest in dismantling what worked. But the quality of the house had changed in a manner that any person of reasonable sensitivity would have detected within 5 minutes of entering it. The sealed isolation was gone. The household had a vitality that isolation could not produce, small but genuine, the specific life of a place where people were engaged in things that mattered to them. Arabella's correspondence had extended considerably beyond estate matters. She wrote to Dr. Pemberton monthly, and to Dr. Ashworth, and to 2 continental specialists whose work on neurological conditions she had obtained through Pemberton's introduction. She was assembling, with the methodical thoroughness she brought to everything she considered worth the effort, a body of documented evidence about the Duke's condition, its patterns, its triggers, the management strategies they had developed together, that she intended to contribute to the emerging literature. It was not the work society would have designed for a duchess. She had never had any interest in the work society designed for duchesses. The Duke managed his estates with a fullness of engagement that isolation had previously constrained, his wife present at every significant decision, not decoratively but practically, her legal and analytical abilities applied to the actual work of the estate with the competence she had always possessed and had never, before Brackenton, been permitted to exercise. The boundary dispute was entirely resolved. The drainage returns were the strongest in a decade. Mr. Fielding the solicitor had become a regular correspondent. 2 people whom society had discarded, one for the crime of an unaccommodated mind, one for the crime of an undecorated one, had built, in the space that society's dismissal had vacated, something society could not have imagined for either of them and would not, if it had tried, have known how to name. They did not require it to. They had, between them, words enough. Thanks for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed the story. You can check out more interesting stories by clicking the tabs on your screen. Don't forget to drop like and subscribe.